Extinguishment of Obligations, Part 2. We're done with payment or performance. Now, let's talk about the loss of the thing due. According to 1262, Article 1262 of the new Civil Code, an obligation which consists in the delivery of a determinate thing shall be extinguished if it should be lost or destroyed without the fault of the debtor, and before he has incurred delay. When by law or stipulation the obliger is liable even for fortuitous event, the loss of the thing does not extinguish the obligation, and he shall be responsible for damages. The same rule applies when the nature of the obligation requires the assumption of risk. Okay? The law is very clear. I will repeat. I will break it down para mas naiintindihan nyo. The first paragraph, according to Article 1262 of the new Civil Code, an obligation which consists in the delivery of a determinate thing shall be extinguished if it should be lost or destroyed without the fault of the debtor and before he has incurred delay. Clearly stated, ang pinag-uusapan natin dito ay determinate thing bago ma-extinguish ang obligation by loss of the thing due or destroyed, plus without the fault of the debtor or before he has incurred delay. The obligation is extinguished without damages. Okay? So talagang wala na siyang obligasyon. But first, we have to define ano ba ibig sabihin ng loss of the thing due. Okay? Ang ibig sabihin ng loss of the thing due is that according to Article 1189 of the new Civil Code, specifically paragraph 2, it is understood that a thing is lost when it perishes, nasira, goes out of commerce, nawala sa sirkulasyon, or disappears in such a way that its existence is unknown and cannot be recovered. Okay? So legally speaking, hindi lang basta-basta yung lost ay yung existence niya unknown or cannot be recovered. Ibig sabihin din ng perishes ay nasisira, nabubulok, goes out of commerce. Ibig sabihin nawala sa sirkulasyon or circulation. Perishes, halimbawa, mga prutas. Okay? You entered into an agreement wherein you are going to deliver 1 kilo of mangoes. However, somewhere along the way, nabulok yung mga mangga. At sabihin mo, di mo naman pwedeng sabihin na, oh, eto pa yung mangga, nandito, bulok na. So, it is already considered lost. In the same manner, goes out of commerce, ang usapan nyo ay magdi-deliver ka ng phone, 5110. After a year, yung palang 5110 hindi na siya functional o hindi na siya magamit. Okay? So may mga ganong aspeto na it will be considered lost. And mga computer, madalas computer yan kasi mabilis. 'Di ba? Mabilis ang palitan sa computer. Kung nangako ka, tapos sinabi mo, 6 months, i-deliver ko sa'yo. Yung i-order ko ng 6 months ago is already out of commerce kasi ngayon advanced na. So, what will happen? Technically speaking, it is already considered lost. Or legally speaking, it is already considered lost. Okay? Question. When loss of thing will or will not extinguish an obligation? Kailan ba na pag ang isang bagay ay nawala, posibleng mag-extinguish or will not extinguish an obligation? First, in order that an obligation may be extinguished by loss of the thing, dapat may mga requisites yan. Okay? Una, the obligation to deliver a specific or determinate thing, dapat determinate thing, the loss of the thing occurs without the fault of the debtor, and the debtor is not guilty of delay. Yan yung first paragraph ng ating Article 1262, saying itong requisite bago mo ma-extinguish ang isang obligasyon. Number 1, dapat determinate thing. So, ibig sabihin, pag generic, hindi. Because ang generic ay hindi nawawala. Dapat determinate or specific. Toyota Corolla with plate number 1234 ABCD. That is a determinate thing. At kung nawala yon dahil hindi naman kasalanan ng debtor or the debtor is not guilty of delay, then the obligation is extinguished. Okay? So, tanong ngayon, will not. Kailan naman will not extinguish an obligation? There are cases, however, when the loss of a specific thing, even in the absence of fault and delay, will not exempt the debtor from liability. So, kailan yun? When the law so provides. Simple, pag sinabi ng batas na kahit nawala yan without your fault or without delay, liable ka pa rin and hindi mawawala ang obligation mo. When the stipulation so provides, pag napag-agrihan nyo na kahit merong delay, merong kasalanan, ang obligasyon ay nandyan pa rin. Okay? When the nature of the obligation requires the assumption of risk. Kadalasan, ito yung tinatawag nating mga insurance. Okay? Nangyayari ito sa insurance because the insurance, ang kanyang obligasyon is lalo na pag may risk o may nangyari because the insurer assumes the risk. Okay? Number 4, when the obligation to deliver a specific thing arises from a crime. Okay? Pag ito ay nanggaling sa isang krimen, yung specific thing na to, it will not extinguish the obligation. That is according to 1268 of the new Civil Code. Okay? Now, what is the effect of loss of a generic thing? Una, ito yung sinasabi nating the debtor, in case of fortuitous event, the debtor is still liable. Kasi ang nawala, generic lang. Di ba? Ibig sabihin, kung ang pinangako mo ay mangga at nawala yung mangga or nasira yung mangga, pwede ka pa naman bumili ulit eh. Diba? Because, technically speaking, hindi siya nawala. Because it's still there. It is replaceable. It is based on the principle that a generic thing never perishes. The debtor can still be compelled to deliver a thing of the same kind. However, the creditor cannot demand a thing of superior quality and neither can the debtor deliver a thing of inferior quality. Hindi pa pwedeng sabihin ng creditor, oh, gusto ko ng mangga, kaya lang this time gusto ko ng, ano ba mas superior sa mangga? Peaches. Yan. Mas superior lang kunyari yun kasi mas mahal yun, tsaka wala sa Pilipinas ng peaches. Or, sasabihin ng debtor, wala akong mangga makita, tapos na ang season ng mangga. Pwede bang i-deliver ko na lang ay lanzones? Yan. So, hindi pa pwede yun. Hindi ko naman sinasabing inferior ang lanzones, but mangoes are, tama ba? The national fruit ng Pilipinas. Okay? So, iba yung level. Ibang level. So, that is the effect of loss of a generic thing because the Article 1262 specifically stated dapat specific or determinate thing ang ating bago magkaroon ng effect ang loss of a thing or extinguishment of an obligation. Next, effect of partial loss of a specific thing. There is partial loss when only a portion of the thing is lost or destroyed, or when it suffers depreciation or deterioration. Partial loss is the equivalent of difficulty of performance in obligation to do. This is Article 1267 of the new Civil Code. So anong effect? In case of partial loss, ang korte is given the discretion in case of disagreement between the parties to determine whether under the circumstances it is so important in relation to the whole as to extinguish the obligation. In other words, the court will decide whether the partial loss is such as to be equivalent to a complete or total loss. Simple lang dito, class. It is the court that will decide whether there is a partial loss or complete loss. Hindi basta-basta yung mga parties lang. That is in case of disagreement. Pero kung nag-agree naman, whether it is considered partial or ano bang tawag doon? Equivalent na siya to a complete loss or total loss. Kung hindi lang magdi-disagree yung both parties, that's the only time papasok ang korte at sasabihin ng korte, pwede na natin i-consider yan total loss. Then, pag kinonsider na total loss, that will extinguish the obligation. Okay? Now, I can give you an example. S obliged himself to deliver to B a specific racehorse, pangkarera. The horse met an accident as a result of which it suffered a broken leg. Napilayan. So the injury is permanent. Here, the partial loss is so important as to extinguish the obligation. Kasi ganun ka-importante. Napilayan. Racehorse. Paano yun? So, hindi na. So, it will extinguish the obligation. Okay? Now, what else? Effect of impossibility of performance. This time, according to Article 1266, the debtor in obligations to do shall also be released when the prestation becomes legally or physically impossible without the fault of the debtor or the obliger. Anong effect? Sinasabi dito, kung without the debtor's fault, the obligation becomes legally and physically impossible. The impossibility of performance will result in the extinction or extinguishment of the obligation, because this impossibility must take place after the constitution of the obligation. If the obligation is impossible from the very beginning, the obligation is void. In such case, there is no obligation to be extinguished. Okay? Yung impossibility ng performance will result to extinguishment of obligation. Pero kung simula pa lang, imposible na ang kondisyones ng ating obligasyon, it is already void. Okay? So, what are the kinds of impossibility? Meron tayong tinatawag na physical impossibility. Ito yung sa purely personal obligation. When the personal qualifications of the obliger are involved, for example, the obliger dies or becomes physically incapacitated to perform the obligation. So, personal obligation to. Ang obligasyon ko ay gawin ko ang iyong bahay as a painter. Pipinturahan ko. Namatay ako. Diba? So, imposible na. Physical impossibility. Or, napilayan ako. Hindi ko nakakayanin. Naputol ang kamay ko. Napilayan ang kamay ko, hindi ko na magawa. There's already physical impossibility. Now, ano pa yung isa? Yung tinatawag nating legal impossibility. Ito naman occurs when the obligation cannot be performed because it is rendered impossible by provision of the law. Okay? Ano yung mga pwede nating example? Okay? D agreed to appear as counsel of C in a case. Okay? Kinuha niyang abogado si D. Subsequently, D was appointed judge of the regional trial court. Under the law, judges of regional trial court are prohibited from engaging in the practice of law. So therefore, si D ay release of his obligation. Yung law mismo makes the execution impossible by imposing upon D the duties of a superior character which may be incompatible with the performance of the obligation contracted by him. Okay? So that is legal impossibility. So these are the kinds of obligation. Okay? Now, effect of difficulty of performance. The general rule is that impossibility of performance releases the obligor. That's the general rule. However, when the performance of the service has become so difficult as to be manifestly beyond the contemplation of both parties, again, the court is authorized to release the obligor in whole or in part, or it will be doing violence to the intention of the parties to hold the obligor still responsible. Diba? Hindi na pwede yun. The court cannot force, okay, if there is already difficulty in the performance, because ang sinasabi lang naman natin dito is impossibility. Pero kung difficulty na, the court will rule either pwedeng complete, pwedeng incomplete, pwedeng wag na ituloy, because mahirap din naman kung merong repercussions kung tutuloy pa yung paggawa, because this is obligation to do. Okay, there is an element of unforeseen or fortuitous event in the situation covered by Article 1276. Okay, because 1267 is applicable not only to personal obligation to do, but also to real obligations to give or to deliver. Okay? So, ang ibig sabihin lang nito, ito kasi nag-a-apply dun sa to give and to do. On the other hand, yung 1276 kasi covered pa yun ng unforeseen. There is an element of unforeseen event. Example, para mas maintindihan nyo, si D agreed to construct a road near a mountain. A very strong typhoon caused an avalanche, making the construction of the road dangerous to human lives, which was not foreseen or contemplated by the parties. In this case, D may be released in whole or in part from his obligation to continue with the construction. Okay? So, pwede nang hindi ituloy because this is already beyond the control of D to continue. Okay? So, that is loss of a thing due. Okay? Now, let's move to the third, extinguishment of obligation, which is condonation or remission of debt. When we say condonation or remission of debt, according to Article 1270, condonation or remission is essentially gratuitous and requires the acceptance of the obligor. It may be made expressly or impliedly. One and the other kind shall be subject to the rules which govern inofficious donations. Express condonation shall furthermore comply with the forms of donation. Okay? Ang sinasabi lang ng paragraph 1 ng Article 1270 is the meaning of condonation or remission of debt, because it is a gratuitous abandonment by the creditor of his right against the debtor. Simple lang yon. Gratuitous. Ibig sabihin, walang hinihinging kapalit. Walang pabigat. So, binibigay niya, inaabandona niya yung kanyang right or obligation. Pinapayagan niya ang debtor na, sige na, gratuitous, buong puso, walang halong kapalit o walang hinihinging kapalit. Okay? Pero, ang importante rito is that it requires acceptance. Ang acceptance niya may be in writing, express, or impliedly. Hindi na humabol. Okay? That is condonation. For you to clearly understand, what are the requisites? Lagay na lang natin. Ano ba yung mga requisites? Una, gratuitous. Pangalawa, accepted by the obligor. Pangatlo, parties must have the capacity. Tandaan nyo ha, kasi in donation, may mga requirement. Capacitated ka ba magbigay? Pwede ka bang magbigay? And it must not be inofficious. Kasi ibig sabihin ng inofficious, dapat tama lang ang pagbibigay. Okay? Kasi condonation yan gratuitous yan. Minsan merong mga nakakapagtaka. Kaya dapat inofficious. Yung tama lang, official. Ika nga. Now, the last one is it made expressly. It must comply with the forms of donation. Kasi lahat ng donation dapat ina-accept yan. Tinatanggap. Okay? Bigyan ko ng example dun sa inofficious ha. There are certain gifts that are only limited lang. Hindi pa pwedeng malakihan. One example sa mga donation. Donation na example ko, not really condonation. Bibigyan ko lang ka ng idea kung ano yung tinatawag nating inofficious. Government employee ay hindi pwedeng tumanggap ng, siyempre alam naman natin, hindi pwedeng tumanggap ng pera or kahit anong regalo ng ibang panahon. Usually, pag Christmas lang. Pero yung pag Christmas na yun, hindi pa dapat yun bonggang-bonggang regalo. Usually, yung pinaka-simple lang, cake. Yan, pwede magbigay ang mga suppliers ng cake. Pero during birthdays lang. Hindi pa pwedeng magbigay ng kotse. Because it already is considered a violation of the anti-graft and corrupt practices. Okay? So, what are the kinds of remission? As to its extent, pwedeng complete when it covers the entire obligation. So, pwede ring partial when it does not cover the entire obligation. Complete, buo, binibigay ko. Partial, kalahati lang. As to its form, yung sinasabi nating express when it is made either verbally or in writing. Expression. Sinulat na, tinibigay ko sa iyo to. Or, sinulat niya bago niya sabihin. Or, sinulat niya or sasabihin niya. Direct. Implied, when it only can be inferred from the conduct. Or, pwede yun nga, sinasabi ko, inferred meaning, ito yung conduct na pinakita. Pinakita. Yan. In Tagalog, inferred means pinakita. Pinakitang asal. Pinakitang conduct ng creditor. Bawa, may utang kang 10,000. O, pag dinonate mo, sige, sa'yo na yung 10,000. Or, sumulat ka na sa'yo na yung 10,000. Pero yung inferred conduct, kuya, may utang ako sa'yo, 10,000. Malis ka na lang, hindi mo na siningil. That is ipinakitang conduct or inferred from the conduct of the creditor. As to its date of effectivity, ano ba yung effectivity nito? Inter vivus, ibig sabihin lifetime ng donor. When it will take effect during the lifetime of the donor, habang buhay yung nagbigay. Okay? Yung donation na yon is during his lifetime. Okay? Meron kasi tinatawag tayong mortis causa. Ibig sabihin ng mortis causa, it will become effective upon the death of the donor. Of course, it must comply with the formalities of a will. Halimbawa, may utang si A kay B. Okay? Si B, hindi na siya naniningil. Pero sinasabi niya, pag namatay ako, I am releasing A from his obligation ng kanyang pag-ungutang sa akin. So, dapat ilagay niya yun sa will. Kasi yung formalities nun, importante yun. That is part of condonation or remission para ma-extinguish ang isang obligation. Okay? Next, effect of inofficious remission. While a person may make donations, no one can give more than that which he can give by will, otherwise the excess shall be inofficious and shall be reduced by the court accordingly. Yan yung sinasabi ko kanina. Okay? Hindi ka pwede magbigay ng wala ka. Kung ano man yung nasa will na yon, the court may reduce it. Okay? Yung excess nun is already inofficious. As a rule, testamentary dispositions which impair the legitime shall be reduced on petition of the heirs. So kasi sinasabi doon, nagpetition, ba't sobra ang kanyang binigay? Sobra ang binigay niya dun sa aming isang kapatid. So the heirs may file a petition to the court asking for the reduction of the donation. Okay? Ng legitime. Incidentally, legitime is that part of the testator's property which he cannot dispose of because the law has reserved it for certain heirs. Okay? Who are therefore called compulsory heirs. Yun yung legitime. So, hindi niya pwedeng malagpasan yun. Pag umabot na sa legitime, yung legitime para sa compulsory heirs yun, sa mga anak. Yun ang compulsory heirs natin. So, ang effect nun, general effect is it will be reduced by the court. Okay? Now, what are the effects or effect of renunciation of the principal debt? Okay? Ano ang effect nun of principal debt? Pag sinabi natin principal debt, syempre merong accessory obligation. Ibig sabihin lang nito, the accessory follows the principal. While the accessory obligations cannot exist without the principal obligation, the latter may exist without the former. Diba? Principal obligation or principal debt. Halimbawa, 10,000. Yun ang principal debt. Pag hindi ka nakapagbayad ng principal debt, meron kang interest na 500. The interest of 500 cannot exist without the principal. Saan manggagaling yung 500? But, ang principal can always exist without the interest. So, accessory yung interest, principal yung loan. So, dun yung malalaman yon. So, principal debt. So, the accessory follows the principal. So, ano magiging effect? Pag renunciate ko or kinondone ko yung principal debt, anong mangyayari? Of course, the answer is mawawala rin yung accessory. Pero, pag tinanggal or kinondone ko or niremit ko yung accessory, ano mangyayari sa principal? Tuloy pa rin. Yung mawawala lang yung interest. Nakuha yung difference? Example, si D owes 1,000 with G as guarantor. The principal debt here is the 1,000 while the accessory obligation is the guarantee of G. So dito guarantee ang accessory, ginagarantiyahan ni G. The remission of the debt of D by C shall extinguish the guarantee. Okay? Ganun lang kasimple. Tanggal din ang guarantee. Pero, if the guarantee of G is condoned, yun yung kanyang remission, then the obligation of D shall remain in force. Okay? So, the accessory follows the principal. Next, presumption in case sting pledge found in the possession of debtor. Okay? Pag yung pledge, pag yung binigay na property. Okay? In a contract of pledge, it is necessary that a thing pledged be placed in the possession of the creditor, okay, or of the third person by common agreement. A third person is not a party to the principal of may secure the latter by pledging his own property. If the thing pledged is later found in the hands of the debtor or the third person, only the accessory obligation of the pledge is presumed remitted, not the obligation itself. The debtor shall continue to be indebted, but he does not have to return the thing pledge. The presumption yields to the contrary evidence. It does not arise if the third person in possession of the thing pledge does not own the same. Okay, bigyan ko kayo ng example para mas maintindihan nyo. But before that, define ko muna ang pledge. Ang pledge is a contract by virtue of which the debtor delivers to the creditor or to a third a movable or instrument evidencing incorporational rights for the purpose of securing the fulfillment of a principal obligation, with the understanding when the obligation is fulfilled, the thing delivered shall be returned with all the fruits and accessories. Usually, ito yung mga, para mas maintindihan nyo class, yung mga stocks. Okay? Stocks to usually. Incorporeal rights. Diba? So ngayon, bigyan ko lang kayo ng example. Okay? Pag na-define ko yun. Bukod sa kasi sa usual na stocks, pwede rin natin gamitin yung diamond ring or sing-sing or jewelry. D delivers to C his diamond ring in pledge to guarantee the payment of a loan. If later on the ring is found in the possession of D, the presumption is that C agreed to the loan without the pledge. So, ganun lang kasimple yun. So, pag nakita nyo yung property pledge or yung thing pledge nasa kamay na ng credit ng debtor, ibig sabihin pumapayag na yung contract of pledge ay na-cancel na. Okay? Wala na. Pero ang tanong kasi rito is that may utang pa ba? Meron pa bang agreement? Then it is dependent upon the situation. Okay? If there is a stipulation na pag sinole or na-assume na nasa kanya na, then the whole obligation is extinguished. Otherwise, it will just be a simple loan without the contract of pledge. Because in this case, C may prove that he returned the ring to D upon the latter's request to be delivered back to him. Kasi pwede naman yun eh. Okay? It is allowed. So that is condonation or remission. Now, we move to confusion or merger of right. When we speak of confusion or merger of right, according to Article 1275 of the New Civil Code, the obligation is extinguished from the time the characters of creditor and debtor are merged in the same person. Ulitin ko ha, sabi ng Article 1275, the obligation is extinguished from the time the characters of creditor and debtor are merged in the same person. Nag-isa. Okay? Anong meaning? It is the meeting in one person of the qualities of creditor and debtor with respect to the same obligation. Okay? Ano ba ang reason or basis ng confusion? Okay. Number 1, the law treats confusion or merger as a mode of extinguishing obligations because if a debtor is his own creditor, enforcement of the obligation becomes absurd since a person cannot claim payment from himself. Patawa nga naman yun, no? 'Di ba? Because yung debtor naging creditor ng sarili niya. So, paano mangyayari? Alangan naman maningil pa siya sarili niya. So, ibig sabihin lang nun, ini-extinguish yung obligation. Furthermore, when there is a confusion of rights, the purposes for which the obligation may have been created are deemed realized. Okay? Na-realize na. Bigyan natin ng example. But before that, ano ba muna yung requisites ng valid confusion or merger? First, it must take place between the principal debt and creditor. And it must be complete. Okay? Example, si D may utang kay C 10,000 for which D executed a negotiable instrument. Pag-aaralan nyo ito sa Law 3. Negotiable instrument. Or check na lang, nakalagay cash para mas maintindihan nyo. Pay to cash the amount of 10,000 pesos in favor of C. Sabi ni C, sige, natanggapin ko tong C na to. Kaso si C, ibinayad naman yung cheque niya kay E At si E, ibinayad naman yung cheque kay F. Ngayon, ginawa ni F, bumili siya sa tindahan ni D. Yung tindahan na binila ni F ay kay D pala. So, nagkakahalaga ng 10,000 yung nagastos ni F para dun sa grocery. So, ang ginawa niya, binigay niya yung cheque na galing kay E, na galing din kay C. So, ano gagawin ni D? Papa-encash niya ba yung cheque? No need. Because nag-merge na yung pagkatao ni creditor at debtor sa isang tao. Nakuha niyo, class? Because there is already a merger of the creditor and debtor in one and the same person. So that is confusion or merger of rights. Requisites. So what will be the effect of merger in the person of the principal, debtor, or creditor? Merger in the person of the principal, debtor, or creditor extinguishes the obligation. No doubt about that. Hence, the accessory obligation of guarantee is also extinguished in accordance with the principle that accessory follows the principal. Okay? So, ganun na kasimple yun, class. Now, confusion or merger of right. Ito yung, sabi nga nila, ito yung balikpato. Sa kalsada, tawag namin dyan, balikpato. Okay? So, that is confusion or merger. Thank you and watch out for the part